Democrats in Congress are fighting against Donald Trump and for democracy. Congressman Ritchie Torres is here to discuss. Welcome back to Defending Democracy. I'm Marc Elias. Let's get started. Congressman Ritchie Torres, welcome to Defending Democracy.
It's an honor to be with you.
All right, I got to start with something that obviously you know well, and those of us in New York know, but people may not know about you. You represent a pretty unique district. It is a majority Latino district. It is also one of the districts that is most dependent on Medicaid. It's a low income district on average. And so I'm curious, watching your Republican colleagues in the House take a sledgehammer to Medicaid and seeing all of the damage that they look to do. This is, I assume, very personal to you and to your community. So tell us a little bit about what this would mean in practice, not in theory, but in practice to people in your district.
So I represent the Bronx, New York 15, which is the lowest income congressional district in America. It is ground zero for racially concentrated poverty. And the Republican reconciliation bill, which is essentially a redistribution of wealth from the poor to the rich, is a catastrophe for a district like mine. There is no district in America that depends more heavily on Medicaid than New York 15 and the Bronx. 67% of my constituents are enrolled in Medicaid. More than 70% of children, more than 80% of nursing home residents, more than 90% of baby deliveries are covered by Medicaid in my district. And Medicaid is not only health care for the lowest income, it is increasingly long-term care for the elderly and the disabled and the chronically ill. In fact, I would submit to you, Medicaid has become every bit as vital to the elderly as Medicare. In New York State, the elderly and the disabled make up about 20% of the enrollees, but 60% of the expenses. Right? In New York State, when it comes to children, the New York State Medicaid program spends about $3,300 per enrollee. Adults, it's $5,900 to $6,900 per enrollee. But for senior citizens, it's $32,000. And for the disabled, it's $35,000. So make no mistake, an attack on Medicaid is not only an attack on the poor, it's an attack on the elderly, on the disabled, on the chronically ill, on the most vulnerable people in our society. And it's deeply personal for me because, I grew up poor in the Bronx, and I spent most of my life in three places: at home, and in school, and in the emergency room, because I had repeat asthma attacks. And I probably would not be alive today were it not for Medicaid and the stability that it brought me and my family.
So when you are in Congress on the floor and this is all going on, I assume that there are some conversations that you would be having with Republicans who also represent districts without, where Medicaid is really important, and that they also represent districts where there is great poverty, and this program is so important. What are they saying to you? What does that look like? Do they just not care? Are they afraid of Donald Trump? Why target the poorest of the poor for cuts in their healthcare? Why target the elderly, as you point out, not just the poor, for their healthcare? What do you think is going on with that?
The Republicans lie and simply deny the reality staring us all in the face. And Republicans make a number of dubious claims. First, the Republicans claim they're only targeting fraud, waste, and abuse. Only fraud, waste, and abuse. Never mind that it's a $715 billion cut that will cause 13.7 million people to lose their health insurance. But setting aside that fact, in 2024, the improper payment rate for Medicaid was around 5%, about $30 billion. 80% of the $30 billion was attributable not to fraud, but to administrative errors, to insufficient documentation. So the amount of fraud in Medicaid is nowhere near the $715 billion cut that Republicans are imposing on the program. So that is a lie. Second, Republicans will claim we're only adding work requirements which again sounds benign on paper, but it's actually deeply destructive in practice. In 2018, Arkansas became the first state
Hmm.
to implement work requirements, which led 18,000 people to lose their health insurance within the first 5 months. And it turns out the majority of those people were actually eligible for Medicaid. And so the purpose of work requirements or frequent eligibility checks is not to root out fraud, waste, and abuse. It's not to encourage the able-bodied to work. It is simply to cause people to lose their health insurance in order to finance tax cuts for the top 1%.
Yeah, and that I think is really important. And I want to move on to democracy issues,
Yeah.
but given who you are and who your constituents are, I really think it's important that the audience start by hearing this.
Yes.
As I understand it, and I'm not an expert in this, you are. When the budget was scored and it produced these revenue savings, it was producing revenue savings because it was kicking people off healthcare. Like it wasn't because it was just, cutting down on waste, fraud, and abuse. It was that the additional essentially paperwork requirements, the additional hoops that people have to jump through would cause people who otherwise are entitled to the healthcare, like they qualify for Medicaid, but they will now not be able to, they now won't have it just because of all the additional rigmarole and paperwork and the like. So it's actually going to save money by denying people who are entitled to Medicaid.
The whole legislation is predicated on displacing people from the social safety net, whether it's healthcare, food. But keep in mind that the bill is not on net a cost savings. It will add up to $5 trillion to the national debt, which is staggering. Like the Affordable Care Act was fully paid for, the Inflation Reduction Act was fully paid for, and we're adding $5 trillion to the national debt at a time when the debt has not only never been larger, but never been more expensive. Right? Debt service, interest on the debt, is the fastest growing item in the federal budget. We're spending more on debt interest than we are in defense, Medicaid, or Medicare, and it's on a trajectory to ultimately surpass Social Security and become the largest line item in the federal budget. We're in a fiscally dangerous place.
All right. I want to turn to democracy because it's really the reason I wanted to have you on. You've been a champion for voting, for champion for democracy, for expanding voting rights, and for protecting people's due process. So we got a lot to cover here in the time that we have. And I want to start, as I mentioned at the top, with your congressional district, which is a majority minority district. And actually, what many people don't know is when people think of the Voting Rights Act and the old pre-clearance as something that was only dealt with in the South, actually, the island of Manhattan and the Bronx were covered. Manhattan and the Bronx were covered by the Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, largely because of the area that you now represent. Now, obviously, the districts have all been like reconfigured over time, but the problem of discrimination in voting is not something foreign to your constituents or to where you represent.
Were it not for Section 5, there would have continued to be disenfranchisement of communities of color, Latinos, and African Americans. And Section 5 is what compelled the political establishment in New York to finally draw fair lines and give the Latino community and the African American community an equal seat at the congressional table, at every table, the city council, the state legislature, and the United States Congress. So for me, it's hard to imagine a more egregious decision from the Supreme Court than a frontal assault on the Voting Rights Act and the heart of the Voting Rights Act. Section 5, I mean, I consider the Voting Rights Act to be the single most critical legislation in American history. Like equality in America became real not when it was proclaimed by the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendment of the Constitution, but when it was enforced, finally, by the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and just as importantly, by the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And even Lyndon Johnson, when he signed it into law, knew that it was so consequential that the Democratic Party would lose the South for a generation. And he was wrong. We've lost the South for multiple generations. But it is by far the greatest legacy achievement of the Democratic Party and of American democracy, which the
And New
Supreme Court
York
is dismantling in real time.
Yeah, and New York has become a little bit of a battleground around voting rights because you continue to see the Republican Party of New York, repeatedly tried to sue to make voting harder in New York. And New York is not exactly the easiest place to vote. Like honestly, I've sued New York because they had a ban on providing food and water to people waiting in line. I don't understand why New York had such a, continued to maintain that ban. I represented the NAACP and we got that struck down. And I'm just curious, as a New Yorker, as someone who represents a poor community and also a majority minority community, how do you talk to your fellow New Yorkers, Democrats and Republicans, about the importance of making voting easier in the state that I'm from, the state you're from?
For me, I mean, voting is not one right among many. It's the fundamental right from which everything else derives. A wise person once said, "If you don't have a seat at the table, then you're probably in the menu." And voting is what gives us a seat at the table. It's what ensures that we have representation at every level of government. And if there's one place on earth that needs representation, it's the Bronx. And I don't mean to suggest there are communities but something tells me the Upper East Side will be just fine. But a place like the Bronx, which depends heavily on government at every level, which needs government to work, needs robust protection of voting rights and robust political representation.
You in Congress, obviously, you were instrumental to the fight for the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act through the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. You were instrumental and supportive, very vocally so, for the Freedom to Vote Act, for the People Act, all bills that passed the Democratic House when Democrats were in charge, all of which were objected to and voted against by literally every single Republican in the House. And sadly, all of which died in the Senate because of the filibuster. Um, how do you, like, reflecting back on that, but also looking forward? What do you see as what Democrats, if Democrats retake control of the House, like what should be the priority around voting? What do you see as the prospects? Do you think things have changed? I assume you agree with me. There's no chance any Republicans would ever support voting rights in the House.
Look, for me, we have to not only double down on our existing democracy agenda, but we have to expand it because Donald Trump is an unprecedented stress test for our democracy in the modern world. And we have to think long and hard about what are the policies and practices we can put in place to rein in the extremes and excesses of a demagogue like Donald Trump. You have to design a system that anticipates the worst case scenario, and an authoritarian figure like Donald Trump is as close to the worst case scenario as one could imagine. But I feel like one piece that's been overlooked is I feel like we in Congress have passed too many laws that have concentrated too much power in the executive. Whether it's the Alien Enemies Act, which enables the president to deport people with no due process, or the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which enables the president to set tariffs at whatever levels he wants. I actually feel those laws are unconstitutional, but we should start repealing dangerously open-ended laws that enable executive authoritarianism. I do feel like the authoritarian moment that we're witnessing in American politics is as much a function of congressional abdication and capitulation as it is of Donald Trump himself.
Yeah, look, Congressman, I think you're 100% right. And I want to actually ask you about one particular law that you are sponsoring, the SAFE Act. But I think it's important that people understand what you just said and how important it is, which is that the framers of the Constitution did not really envision three co-equal branches of government. They really envisioned that the legislature, that Congress would be the center point of power, and that the executive branch, that the president's job would be to take care that the laws were faithfully executed. And those were the laws passed by Congress. And that the judiciary would check either executive overreach or congressional overreach, and that's how the government would hold together. What it did was it assumed that Congress would jealously guard its power from an executive of either party. And instead, what we have watched is Speaker Johnson essentially like just be a jellyfish. Like there's no backbone, there's no spine, There's no one in his caucus who stands up for the legislative power. And it is just an enabling body of the excesses of Donald Trump. And that is, as you say, I believe, along with you, and I think most right-minded people, both an imbalance in the political power. It's also likely a violation of the US Constitution. And in any event, it has set up what is effectively a constitutional crisis of sorts, because the Donald Trump sort of uses these powers that he probably shouldn't have, but that the Congress are the ones to check, and they're not checking. And so I want to start by asking you about the SAFE Act, which, as I understand it, would revoke federal funding if the federal court deemed a foreign detention illegal. So talk a little bit about why you think this is necessary, what motivated this, and sort of what the next steps are for it.
Well, the unprecedented challenge of Donald Trump's presidency is exposing the limits of American democracy and judicial review. As you know, the Supreme Court unanimously, a right-wing Supreme Court unanimously, ordered Donald Trump not to effectuate, but to facilitate whatever, to facilitate the release of Abrego Garcia, only to have the decision ignored, not only by Donald Trump, but also by the Salvadorian government. It's obvious that Donald Trump has made no good faith effort at facilitating the release of Abrego Garcia.
Don't you think if Donald Trump said to them, give me him back, they give him back?
I'm sorry?
Don't you think that if Donald Trump actually said to the El Salvador president, I want him back?
Of course.
Yeah.
Of course he has leverage.
Well, you think he hasn't done a good faith effort? Like, I mean, has he done any effort?
No, I was just, this semantic game that the Supreme Court played between effectuate and facilitate, I thought was a little silly, but he ignored the decision. And so my view is there should be a law. I introduced the SAFE Act that prohibits the use of federal funds for any foreign detention that violates a court order. So the moment a court deems a foreign detention illegal, federal funding should be revoked, because Donald Trump might not be directly detaining Abrego Garcia, but he's doing so indirectly. The Salvadorian government is effectively operating as a contractor for the Trump administration. He's receiving money to detain these immigrants.
And so for people who are not familiar with how the House of Representatives works, you introduced the bill. Like, what is the next step there?
Look, we're going to build support, but as you know, we're going to face resistance from Republicans, and Republicans control both the Senate and the House. But, you know, it goes to my earlier point. We have to be we have to be broadening our notion of what constitutes a pro-democracy agenda, and learning from the experience of a Donald Trump presidency and putting in place laws that will prevent a repeat of history, because we ignore what Donald Trump is doing at our own peril. And I worry the damage he's doing to our democracy will endure long after he's gone.
Yeah, look, and I think part of the reason why it's important that someone like you introduces this bill now is because, you know, we can't act like for the 2 years that we're in, we don't have to do anything, because there's no power, right? We have no power to do anything. Like, we have to show that we are willing to be thinking aggressively and innovatively and putting forward solutions, because that's what gives the American people the sense that there is a reason to elect Democrats. Like, you know, I assume you're in a fairly safe district, so maybe not you, but like by having leaders like you put these ideas forward, I think it helps Democrats everywhere.
I also feel like the most common refrain I've heard from people on the ground is, we need you to fight.
Yeah.
Like, we feel our democracy is at risk, and we want Democrats, even those in the minority, to fight their heart out to resist the abuses of Donald Trump. And of all the abuses of the Trump presidency, none is a graver threat to our freedom than his assault on due process and democracy and habeas corpus.
So I've been wanting to ask you this question because you represent a district that has economic hardship, and because you are a leader in the pro-democracy movement. One of the things you will sometimes hear in the consultant class is, oh, we shouldn't talk about these democracy issues because people are focused on the bread and butter issues of prices and, you know, and being able to make ends meet. So how do you answer, as someone who represents a lot of constituents who have to worry about prices and making ends meet, but also talks about democracy, like how do you, what's your answer to those folks who say, don't talk about democracy, just focus on prices?
I think the consultants are, first we should ignore the consultants who cost us the 2024 election. And the consultants, as usual, are creating a false choice, a conflict where none exists. We can speak about both. We can speak about the practical bread and butter concerns that appeal to everyday people, that weigh heavily on everyday people. But we also could speak about first principles. Like if we're not here to defend something as foundational as due process and habeas corpus, then I'm not sure why we're here. I feel like we have no business being in public office if we're going to be silent on the fundamentals of our democracy. You know, when you review the Bill of Rights, it just becomes evident to me that there was no issue that mattered more to the framers than the rights of the accused. There are more provisions about the rights of the accused than there are about free speech or religious liberty, all of which are critical. And, you know, Donald Trump is setting a precedent that could come back to haunt all of us. You know, if you accept the premise without due process, you know, what is to stop Donald Trump from misclassifying any one of us as a non-citizen gang member and abducting us in the dead of night and then rendering us to a torture chamber to El Salvador? Like without, you know, due process is what protects all of us. And I feel like an attack on the due process rights of anyone is an attack on the due process rights of all.
I'll be right back with more of my conversation with Congressman Torres in a moment to support the hard work of the team at Democracy Docket, which is tracking over 200 active voting rights and democracy cases. Become a premium member today. For $10 a month, you'll get access to exclusive events, my insights, and much, much more. So sign up above at the link or in the show notes below. So you were New York City's youngest elected official at age 25 and the first LGBTQ person elected to office in the Bronx. And when you were in state government, you passed over 40 pieces of legislation, including tackling affordable housing and opiate addiction and that crisis. And I'm just curious, you know, you're in Congress right now, we're in the minority. What did those achievements, you know, the fact that you did this at such an extraordinarily young age, the fact that you were able to, you know, win when people didn't think you necessarily were going to, the fact that you won your congressional seat, I could go on, and people weren't sure you were going to, like, what does that tell you? I mean, what it tells me is that perseverance matters. But what have you learned from this background that you think people, Democrats and voters, need to understand?
American democracy is worth preserving because stories like mine are not possible without democracy. About a decade before entering Congress, I was at the lowest point of my life. I had dropped out of college. I found myself struggling with depression, abusing substances. I thought of taking my own life because I felt as if the world around me had collapsed. And I never thought in my wildest dreams that I would have a fighting chance to rebuild my life. And a few years later, become the youngest elected official in America's largest city, and then ultimately become a member of the United States Congress. And we're not for the Voting Rights Act. We're not for the democracy reforms that were championed by the Democratic Party and by our greatest civil rights leaders. I never would have an opportunity, someone like me from a background like mine, to serve in the most prestigious and powerful legislature on earth. Only democracy makes that possible. And so for me, the lesson learned from my life is that democracy is worth preserving, it's worth fighting for, because it's what provides us with opportunity.
What do you tell your constituents who are disillusioned, you know, are concerned, they are worried? They're worried about prices, they're worried about democracy, they're worried that their healthcare may be cut. You know, I am sure as you walk down the streets of your district, people don't know what to do. What do you tell them when they tell you their word? What words of hope do you offer them, or do you offer them words of hope?
Look, I tell them that never lose hope. And I know we're all anxious about Donald Trump. But, you know, Donald Trump is not the greatest challenge that American democracy has ever seen, right? Slavery was a greater challenge. Jim Crow was a greater challenge. Think about just the violence of the 1960s, the assassination of a president and a civil rights leader and a presidential candidate, the Civil War. And so, America historically has had enough resilience to overcome some of the greatest challenges, and we will overcome Donald Trump, but we have to be willing to fight. We have to be willing to build power. And historically, the far right has been far more effective at building power than we have in the Democratic Party. I once heard a commentator make the following observation: the left owns culture, but the right owns power. So while we were building influence in places like the university, the right was focused on state legislatures and courts. And it turns out state legislatures and courts are what matter. And we're playing catch up. But we should view the re-election of Donald Trump as an awakening for those of us in the Democratic Party who care deeply about the survival and success of our democracy.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because that's very much true of how we got here. Although now we watch as Donald Trump and his cronies attack judges.
Yeah, are turning on. And yet the court might even empower him nonetheless, because it feels to be the Supreme Court is moving in the direction of codifying the unitary executive theory, which will destabilize the operation of our government. I mean, if the president has the unilateral authority to fire the chair of the Federal Reserve, it's going to send. If you thought Liberation Day was a nightmare for our economy, just stay tuned.
Yeah, and the fact is, I said to folks when they started to get enthusiastic about the court, because it ruled, as you said, 9-0 in the case involving the Salvadorian Gulag. The fact that it has shown some signs of life. That the way to understand the current Supreme Court is ask yourself: is the court vindicating the power of the court, or is the court dealing with the power of the president to run the executive branch? Donald Trump is winning those second cases. Like, he's winning the, as you say, the unitary executive cases. The cases
he wants to win, by the way.
The cases he wants to win, right? It's the cases where the justices feel like the power of the court's at stake, where they are surprising people and pushing back. But I think we're in for a relatively long 3+ years of the courts letting Donald Trump as president run the executive branch however he wants. And that includes, Congressman, I want to ask you specifically about the weaponization of government and what it means if he controls the Department of Justice, what it means if he controls the IRS, what does it mean if he decides, I don't want to give benefits to Harvard, I don't want to give benefits to people who live in, Ritchie Torres' district.
Well, Mark, I mean, the weaponization of government is a fait accompli. I mean, the Supreme Court held that the president is absolutely immune when exercising his core presidential powers. And I believe in the decision, the court even says that any conversation between the president and the attorney general is immune from prosecution or admission of evidence in court. And so if that's the case, I mean, what is to stop the president from directing the attorney general to target his political enemies? What's to stop the president from directing his SEC chair to target politically disfavored corporations? I mean, we're seeing the weaponization of government in real time against his political enemies, like Just James, and it's only going to deepen. So I feel, Trump 2.0 is not only quantitatively but qualitatively different from Trump 1.0. He's much more vindictive. He's much more aggressive. He's much more emboldened than ever before. And I do believe he's emboldened by the absolute immunity that the Supreme Court has conferred upon him.
Yeah, look, I think you could look at the situation in New Jersey with the Democratic members of Congress who decided to visit that ICE facility, which is, by the way, statutorily their right. Like, it is part of the law that members of Congress get to do this, and
it's an exercise of our congressional oversight.
Yeah, it is. It's both a constitutional power that you have. It is also a statutory power that you have. And yet I've been surprised at how little outrage there has been among the broader Republican, even, I maybe thought Republicans because I think you think they might want to do these oversight visits when there's a Democratic president, but it's been too quiet for my taste.
Well, I think the evil genius of Donald Trump is that if you flood the zone and exhaust everyone, there's only so much outrage that people can display. But the Republican Party is just an embarrassment. I mean, it's no longer a traditional political party. It's become a cult of personality around Donald Trump. And the Republican Party is standing by passively while Donald Trump is dismantling the power of congressional Republicans. It is a religion, and Donald Trump is their Lord and Savior.
Yeah, I wrote about this for Democracy Docket, that J.D. Vance went to the Vatican, met with the Pope, and then immediately afterwards gave an interview in which he managed to find disagreements with the Pope, disagreements with the Vatican, disagreements with Congress, disagreements with the courts, in fact, quite critical of the courts. The only thing that J.D. Vance found was perfect in that interview was Donald Trump. And that seems to be the mindset, not just of the vice president, but, Mike Johnson. When was the last time you heard Mike Johnson or a Republican in the House criticize Donald Trump?
Look, there are members of Congress who think Donald Trump should have been the Pope, who have proposed that Donald Trump be included in Mount Rushmore, or that he should be included in one of our national currencies. I mean, it's ridiculous. Just the level of, the elevation of Donald Trump, probably morally the worst person in the United States, to the status of a deity.
So I have been a regular critic, like a vocal critic, of your Republican colleagues from New York. Part of it is I'm from New York. I actually grew up in Rockland County, which is a swing district in the state. It was for a number of years held by a Democrat, former Congressman Mondaire Jones. It's now held by a Republican Congressman, Mike Lawler. But there are several of these Republicans in the downstate area. And I've been very critical of them because I think they talk a game sometimes about, trying to be moderates. But my view is there are no moderates in the Republican House. Like they're just votes for Donald Trump's agenda in the same way that others are. And I'm curious if your experience with them, either individually or as a class, is any different than that.
Look, I know and like many of them on a personal level, but the fact is New York receives upward of $50 billion in Medicaid funding from the federal government, and every one of them voted to defund Medicaid at the expense of New York. I mean, that's just inexcusable. It's unforgivable.
One last New York question about Republicans. So I get asked all the time by people who know that I'm from New York and have been involved in Democratic politics. What happened to Elise Stefanik? So she was a somewhat moderate Republican for upstate New York, and now she's like the leader of the band of Trump.
Look, it will come as a shock to you that not everyone who enters politics has a deeper set of values. And I suspect she made a political calculation that the momentum of the Democratic Party lies with MAGA, and she had to radically reinvent herself to fit the new direction of the Democratic Party. And the perverse incentive structure of Republican politics rewards extremism. And that's what we see unfolding. And the Republicans who have managed to hold on to their integrity have been relegated to the margins. So that's how. But I feel like in the end, MAGA is a dying movement. I think we're witnessing the final gasp of a dying movement. I feel like Donald Trump is a singular phenomenon in American history, and I'm not clear that the inroads that he's made among a number of Democratic constituencies are transferable to the rest of the Republican Party.
So if Democrats retake control of the House in 2026, as I think they will, what is the pro-democracy legislation or the pro-democracy action that you think Democrats should take on, either first or in the first, the first bunch of stuff they did?
Well, I think we should continue what we've done before, right? The John Lewis Voting Rights Act, the freedom to vote for the people, but also I would recommend repealing the Alien Enemies Act.
Yeah.
Or repealing the pertinent provisions of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or advancing legislation that would prevent a repeat of Doge, and protect the sensitive personnel and payment systems of our country. The fact that Doge had access to the Bureau of Fiscal Research, which is the America's paycheck, it's the central payment system of the federal government, is unacceptable. Just like you would not allow anyone access to the nation's nuclear codes, we should not allow anyone access to our bank account or to our checkbook. And so I would pass legislation that responds to each and every one of the abuses that we've seen arise during Trump's presidency.